I realized as these men started telling me what they'd actually be thinking in that particular scene, I was like, seriously? Myself really shocked by some
Wow.
of the things I was hearing. And so I did more and more of these conversations, and I finally, it sort of clicked in that what I was hearing, it wasn't just that it was surprising. What I
Mhm.
was hearing was really foundational. Like
Wow.
these weren't thoughts or feelings that these men were describing that, kind of came up every couple of months. These were things that they were describing that they thought they felt every single day,
Mm.
multiple times a day.
Wow.
And at that point, I'd been married maybe 6, 7, 8 years, something like that. And of course, I'm like, why haven't I heard this?
Hi, you're listening to Java with Jen with your host, Jenna Lee Samuel. On this show, I bring the simplicity of hearing God's voice into everyday life in a no-nonsense, authentic, and super practical way. With coffee in hand and real life in our faces, let's do this.
Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for joining me for another episode here at Java with Jen. I have a guest on my show today who I'm so excited to A, meet, but then B, to bring to you guys because I stumbled across her books literally way back in the beginning of my marriage when I was struggling with marriage. I was grasping at straws looking for books that could help make me make sense of my husband. And I came across her book called For Women Only, and she also has a companion book for men only. And so I was reading her book a few weeks ago. I pulled it out because I was starting to struggle with, I have 4 teenage boys, and I was like, there has to be a better way than how we're doing this. And so I was like, let me pull out her book. It'll probably give me some tools for helping with my sons. And then I thought, why don't I have her on the show and we can talk about it in person? And this will become therapy for Jen with Shaunti. So, Shaunti, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Absolutely. Okay, that cracks me up. I love that introduction.
I mean, let's be real, right? That's the gist I get of you too from your books is that you're very real and you're like, let's get practical. Let's dig into the real stuff
Yeah.
here. So let me go ahead and introduce you. For those that are not familiar who Shaunti Feldhahn is, she received her graduate degree from Harvard University, come on now, and was an analyst on Wall Street before unexpectedly becoming a social researcher and a best-selling author and a popular speaker. Her groundbreaking research-based books, such as For Women Only and For Men Only, have sold more than 3 million copies in 25 languages. Her books and studies are popular in homes, counseling centers, and corporations worldwide. She, often with her husband Jeff, speaks at events each year around the world, sharing her findings with a wide range of audiences such as churches, corporate events, women's conferences, universities, and the list goes on. Her research and commentary are regularly featured in media as diverse as The Today Show, Focus on the Family, the New York Times, and Family Life. Oh, that's incredible. So as you guys can tell, those of you who are listening, she is well equipped for the conversation that we are going to be having. And Shaunti, I want to make the most of this time and I want to dive right in. Why don't you tell us first, how did this topic even get on your radar? Like what made you want to write books about this?
So the way this whole thing started is so different than anything that I thought that I would be doing. Because,
Uh-huh.
like you mentioned, I'd been an analyst
Mm-hmm.
on Wall Street, had that sort of analytical background. This whole thing started, sort of a long story, but the short version is that when Jeff and I moved from New York to Atlanta, which is where
Mm-hmm.
we live today, I had this crazy opportunity to write a couple of novels. And this whole thing began because
Uh-huh.
one of the main characters in one of the novels that I was writing was a man.
Uh-huh.
And I realized I didn't know how to put thoughts in his head. Like
Oh,
I
wow.
couldn't just say what this main character was doing. Like I had to say what the guy was thinking, right?
Uh-huh.
And I'm realizing I have no idea what a guy would be thinking. And some of these situations I was putting him in were really personal kind of situations. And so this whole thing started because I would ask Jeff, my husband, or we'd be out to dinner with another couple and I'd go to the other husband and I'd be like, "Can I interview you? Here's the scene in the novel in this story. What would you be thinking
Yeah.
if this was you?"
Yeah.
And I realized as these men started telling me what they'd actually be thinking in that particular scene, I was like, seriously? Like I was found myself really shocked by some
Wow.
of the things I was hearing. And so I did more and more of these conversations, and it sort of clicked in that what I was hearing, it wasn't just that it was surprising. What I was hearing was really foundational. Like
Wow.
these weren't thoughts or feelings that these men were describing that, kind of came up every couple of months. These were things that they were describing that they thought they felt every single day,
Mm.
multiple times a day.
Wow.
And at that point, I'd been married maybe 6, 7, 8 years, something like that. And of course, I'm like, why haven't I heard this?
Right.
And so I think that's when the analyst hat went on. And that's when it's a long story, but I feel like God made this amazing way
Wow.
um, for me to do a big nationally representative survey of men and
Wow.
connected me miraculously, like completely miraculously. Even as an analyst, survey design is a real science. Like you have to do it right in
Yeah.
order to not get biased answers and all that. And so God connected us
Wow.
with the former chief of survey design at the US Census Bureau.
Wow.
He said he felt like God was telling him to help us for free because we couldn't afford anything.
That's incredible.
And so that survey became for women only. That's what formed the basis of it. It was okay, all these things that I'd been hearing in the interviews, in the end, they were not all of them, but the ones that were confirmed ended up putting them in the book. And so
Wow.
that launched this whole new world of conducting these research studies. And now we just have finished our 13th big
Wow.
national study.
That's
So
incredible. Okay, so what a really godlike curveball for your life. You went from writing a novel to like pivot. Your whole ministry went another
really,
direction. So are the novels, are they done? Did you finish them?
yeah, there were two of them, and there was supposed to be a third, and I was in the middle of writing the third when I felt like God was like, "Nope, write this book called For Women Only instead."
Wow. And so
So,
how many years ago did you actually write this companion set of books?
For Women Only and For Men Only, the
Yes.
original editions came out. For Women Only came out in 2004, so 20 years
Oh,
ago. We
wow.
just celebrated the 20th anniversary, but there's been a lot of new research. We did a new edition in 2013, and we'll do another one here because we're constantly
That's
doing
incredible.
research, and there's just constantly stuff being added. Jeff and I will do a marriage event because we do a lot of marriage events,
Hmm.
obviously, that encompass some of this. And so we'll every now and then we'll step off stage and be like, a lot of what we just said in there needs to go into the next edition of the book. Like
Yeah.
yeah. So
I would imagine the research never ends, which is probably like the love-hate relationship with research-based books is you're like, oh, now I got to update it again.
yeah,
Okay,
exactly.
so I want to read some of the titles of your chapters to the listeners real quick so they can get a taste. Because listen, listeners, you're going to want to go buy this book. Like you're just going to want to. Just go already while you're listening, just hit pause, go to Amazon, just buy the book, and then come back and you're going to appreciate it even more. Okay, so first chapter, Light Bulb on How I Woke Up to What I Didn't Know About Men. Two, Your Love is Not Enough, Why Your Respect Means More to Him Than Even Your Affection. Three, The Performance of a Lifetime. Why your Mr. Smooth looks so impressive but feels like an imposter. Four, The Thinker. My husband is a thinker. Why checking out is actually checking in. I can't tell you how many times him checking out has made a fight for us because I thought he was abandoning me and really he was trying to think. Okay. Number five, The Loneliest Burden. How his need to provide weighs your man down and why he likes it that way. Number six, we do talk about sex. Sex changes everything. Why sex unlocks a man's emotions. Guess who holds the key? Number seven, keeper of the photo files. Why it's so difficult for him not to look and so hard to forget what he's seen. I feel like that chapter was like a pill to swallow.
Oh, you should have seen me during the research. Don't even get me
Oh,
started. I was like,
oh.
oh, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
we're gonna talk about it a little bit. Number eight, chocolate flowers and bait fishing. Why the reluctant Romeo, really does want romance. Number nine, the truth about taking care of yourself. Why what's on the outside matters to him on the inside. I love that you're tackling the like hard questions. Number 10, words for your heart. What your man most wishes you knew about him. Okay, so as you guys can tell, those chapters are like juicy and you're going to want to read all of them. But I love what you're talking about because my husband and I went to dinner with our local mayor a couple of weeks ago, and he was saying that him and his guy friends were sitting around and they were talking, and one of the guys was sharing about how he's like, I just wish my wife knew that, like, when she just touches me on the shoulder or just gives me a little kiss or anything, I feel like a superhero and I would go chop down trees for her, like he was like, but I could never tell her that. And I looked at him and I was like, tell your friend he needs to tell her that, And so, but I realized, and he was like, yeah, no, he's never going to tell her that. And so I'm like, hold up. So guys have this whole reality in their head, possibly, if he represents the general male population. Guys have this whole reality that they want their wife to know, but
Yeah,
they feel like they could never tell her. And I feel like that's the stuff you dive into in your book. Is that fair?
it is fair. Well, and just to be clear about what's going on the inside in those cases, a lot of times it isn't that they know what they're thinking and feeling and they don't want to share, although that could certainly be. And depending on the topic that you just read,
Yeah.
some of those things is like, I'm not going there, right? Like, we're not going to talk about this.
Yeah.
But a lot of times what's actually going on, this is what the men have told me. We've now interviewed and surveyed more than 22,000 men
Wow.
over the years in these big nationally representative surveys, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that they have told me is very common, that the reason their wife gets, For Women Only, which is the
Uh-huh.
book you're talking about, and then goes, honey, is this true? And the husband grabs the book. He's like, who's this woman who's telling my wife, how I think? And he reads and he's like, oh my gosh, I couldn't have explained it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that is what I was thinking, but I didn't have the words for it. I didn't
Yeah.
know how to phrase why something bothered me or why something made me feel so special, and this gives to some degree some language to that. And
Mm-hmm.
of course, for Men Only, the book
Yeah.
about women tends to do the same thing for us.
Uh,
So some of this is just that it's not that they're withholding
mhm.
information, it's they don't know how to explain it.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense because so much of it, even as you describe in your book, is just on a biological fundamental level. And
Yeah.
when these processes are happening just inside of us, naturally, it's not even a cognitive process where we're thinking it through. It's just happening. And often we don't have words for that. Women, the same. So, okay, let's dive into this. So in page 2, actually, there's a phrase in there that says, why did that make him so angry? And I was like, oh, I resonate with that one, and I've got 4
Yeah.
teenage boys and a husband. So I'm surrounded by testosterone, except for the hamster. She's a girl. And so I often have wondered in my marriage, like, why do you get so angry? Which he's had to do some work on that, and some of it was just unhealthy. But there's a natural response of anger that comes out of men when certain buttons are pushed. Can you
Yeah.
talk about that?
Sure. One of the things that we share all the time when we do these marriage events, and that we talk about in the books, and we've got the numbers from the surveys, is that in general, and by the way, we should say up front that when we talk about these surveys and the data, we're making generalizations, right?
Yeah.
There's always going to be exceptions to what we're saying.
Yeah.
By definition, if 80% of men said one way, by definition 20% didn't, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
just use what I'm going to say here as a starting point to have this conversation with your man, see if it's true.
Yeah.
But what we found at about a 75 to 85% level, depending on what the survey questions were and which survey it was, it turns out that a lot of what goes on under the surface and causes pain, not just for men but for women, on both sides, is that we tend to have two different sets of insecurities running under the surface.
Okay.
And if that's true, by definition, it means that something different is going to hurt your man's feelings than would hurt yours.
Mm.
And so think of it like a raw nerve. And so if you're asking, why did that make him so mad? Well, that's an example of maybe this is a situation where you were hitting the raw nerve and you didn't intend to. You wouldn't have done it if you'd known it was a raw nerve, but it was. And so crying or anger tends to be responses to pain. And it tends to be more that women are more likely to have our emotions leak out our eyes, and men are more likely to have their emotions come out in anger. And both of those, neither, it's not an excuse to say, well, I'm just, in pain, so therefore I can get really angry and, scare everybody in the house. No, that's not appropriate. And by the way, if anyone is listening and there is that kind of a situation in your house where it maybe is abusive, where there's maybe extra control, because that can happen on either side, right? Just take what I'm saying as this may be the case about men, but the application in your house may be completely different. And that's where we always say, get the help, right? Get the help of somebody who can come alongside and help. For example, your husband maybe needs to see that this is abusive anger. That's not okay. But a lot of us as women, we need to be okay with the fact that just regular anger, that is often a signal of pain that we would never want to have caused in our husband's heart. And so anger, the Bible doesn't say anger is a sin. It says in your anger, don't sin. And so we do have to be okay with that as a signal for him.
That's so good. Now, because women tend to cry, men tend to get angry, and of course that's not a blanket statement, but it's a generalization. One thing I had read the books Wild at Heart and Captivated back years ago. And they talk about how the core need of a man is respect, and his core fear is, am I enough? Whereas a woman's desire is to be found lovely, and her core question is, am I lovely? And that doesn't mean just physically, but like, am I a lovely person? Like, is my soul lovely? Do I bring beauty into everything that I touch? And so the insecurity for a woman, from what I read in those was, that's why, like, a smart man will never criticize how his wife looks. Like, a smart man will just never go there, right? Well, the opposite could be true then, that a smart woman would never criticize her husband's competence, right? And so is that the button that tends to make him angry, is his competence?
Kind of. Yes, kind of. Let me maybe nuance what you were saying a little bit, because there are women shouting at their podcast device right now, but what about, what about if there isn't something that he does well? Let's back up a little bit. I'll tell you what came out on the surveys, because to me, it's all about what does the data say, right? These were big, expensive, nationally representative surveys. And so what we found is similar to what the Eldridges described. But I think the nuances are important. So in general, about 75 to 85% of women, the question in our hearts is, am I lovable? Okay. So am I lovely is part of that, right? Like, am I special? Am I worthy of being loved for who I am on the inside? That fundamentally is an incredibly important thing for men to know. Like, they all know that women want to feel loved. What they don't realize that even in a great marriage, how easy it is for her to not feel loved, and how easy it is to push that button. That it just, they're like, what? Like, that doesn't make sense to them. But it's because that's the nerve that's being hit. And so, of course, the need that arises out of that is that we want to feel loved, and we want to feel special. We want to feel lovely. We want to feel beautiful, right? For men, it's a completely different question. And so that lends itself to a different set of primary needs. Now, we all are insecure about everything, and we all need everything to some degree. But however, what we're talking about is what tends to hit those nerves that we don't realize. And so the nerve for men, the question for men, again, 75 to 85% of men, isn't, am I lovable? It's, am I able? Am I adequate? Do I measure up? Do I have what it takes? The question could be kind of summarized, am I any good at what I do on the outside?
Ah,
Now think about how different that is, right?
yeah.
Am I worthy of being loved for who I am on the inside
Mm.
versus am I any good at what I do on the outside? That is
Wow.
a completely different question,
Yeah.
and it lends itself to, again, a completely different sort of primary need. Again, we all need everything to some degree,
Mhm.
but the heartbeat for so many men is, and this is what we found on the survey, they said that if they had to make a choice,
Mhm.
which you would never want to have to make this choice, okay, we
Yeah.
forced them into this choice. But 74% of men on this big national survey said, if I have to make a choice, I'll give up feeling that my wife or my girlfriend loves me. I'll give that
Mm.
up if
Wow.
I could just feel that she appreciates me,
Wow.
that she respects me, right? And
Wow.
so having having this sense that my wife appreciates me, she respects me, she believes in me,
Mm.
she trusts me, she admires me, like all of those things tend to be more important in a man's heart
Uh-huh.
even than feeling that his wife loves him. That's a big difference.
That is a huge difference. And it's interesting to me how like it still reiterates the subtle notion that men are more external physical, like their bodies are strong. The way they connect is through wrestling rather
Hmm.
than talking.
Interesting. Yeah.
Like they value sex and that physical connection, whereas women are like, just make eye contact and have a conversation with me. So like women are like the heart and soul, and men are the brawn and and that's not to reduce what they bring to the table at all. But I mean, like, there's a reason God made us complementary. I mean, like it was his physical body that woman was taken out of. She was taken out of his innermost parts, the rib, right? And
Yeah.
so it's just interesting that you still see the echo of that in these small ways.
It will, and it's interesting that the echo of that is so often misunderstood for men today.
Mm,
Because, yeah, they do look so big and so confident in themselves. And we don't realize that what's going on the inside of that big,
yeah,
strong, confident looking man is this big self doubt. Like, I want to be a great husband.
yeah.
I want to be a great dad. I want to be a great salesman or whatever it is that they do, but I'm really not sure that I know what I'm doing and I hope nobody finds out.
Mm,
Right? Like there's this self-doubt that's running under the surface, and that's what we don't realize that we're hitting sometimes.
mm,
That raw nerve. We This is the basic. If you pull back the proverbial 30,000 foot view, if you pull back, one of the things that we have seen, and now it's been 21 years of research, 22 years of research, is that most of the time, now we said sometimes there are abusive relationships that don't apply to this, but most of the time, the vast majority of relationships, you have a husband and a wife who really care about each other. And both of them are trying really hard to love one another well, to care for one another well. But because they don't know some of these things that are running
mhm,
under the surface, they're trying hard in the wrong areas, and they're
mm,
kind of missing each other,
yeah.
and not, making each other feel cared for in the way you should after all my hard work, right? Or they're trying really hard to care and they're actually hurting each other
Yeah.
and in ways that they would never want to. And so the reason I'm so passionate about this, and I'm so grateful that you've found this helpful, is that this is what we're trying to dig out so that you're trying hard in the right areas.
Mm,
And it just makes such a difference, especially because these things, I hate to say it, it's not rocket science. Like
yeah.
this stuff is really simple.
It is, and then, but because it's not our intuitive function as women, we can totally
Yes,
miss it, right?
yes,
So, okay, you bring a couple questions in because none of us women or wives, good wives, don't want to make their husband feel incompetent or like an imposter. They don't want to
correct.
aggravate that. They want to make him
Correct.
feel like the Superman that we feel like he is, right? And so, what are some simple things that we do? Because I have noticed that times when my husband and I have gotten in arguments, and I'll be like, "You didn't do this or you didn't do this," but then his response will be like, "Well, I pay all the bills and I do all this and and so
Right.
and to me it feels like he's like, he's putting his feathers out, like, but look how great I actually am, you know? And so I'm like, what is being aggravated in that conversation? Because it's so predictable, you know, that that's where he goes. And so what is happening under the surface in those conversations, and how can I handle that differently?
So this is you're asking the question that every woman wants to know, including me. When I was doing the research, I was exactly in that same space. Here's the bottom line. We tend to buy the mask. He's confident, he's big boy, he can handle me saying, you didn't do this, 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 this. Suck it up, buttercup. Like,
Uh-huh.
man up, be okay with the fact that I'm like, I really needed you to mow the lawn. Right.
Yeah.
And it didn't get done.
Yeah.
So, or, you know, so why'd you get mad when I came along behind you and put the dishes in the dishwasher the right way? Like, you're so oversensitive. Like, you have such a big ego. Here's what we have to stop and remind ourselves.
Mm.
He doesn't have an ego in the way that we're thinking.
Mm-hmm.
He has deep self-doubt.
Mm.
He has this am I able insecurity running under the surface that doesn't go away just because he's a great husband or he's a great salesman or whatever it is that he does. In the same way that the am I lovable insecurity doesn't go away just because we have a good marriage.
Right.
Right. And so recognizing, okay, it's some of these little things are hitting the nerve. What are those little things? They're going to hit the nerve.
Yeah.
And it is going to be any little, and it's usually, this is where we're like, come on, like you're so oversensitive because it's little things.
Uh-huh.
And it is going to be something that tells him in some small way, I think what you just did is inadequate.
Mm.
That's it. Because he thinks it means I am inadequate. And he like you said, you buck up.
Uh-huh.
And so your question, I think you asked is, so what do you do about that? Right? Like, what do you do differently?
Especially when he's not doing it right.
Right, exactly. But what if you need to come along and the
Yeah.
dishes need to get changed? And by the way, this is incredibly important for boys too.
Mm.
And
Good.
sounds like you're surrounded.
Yeah.
So let me just mention. So this is what after all these years, this is sort of what it comes down to at this most basic level,
Okay.
is realize that anything you wouldn't see it as criticism, they do.
Mm-hmm.
This is where you get to suck it up and be okay with the fact that they are going to see it that way.
Yeah.
Right? Like
Yeah.
there's no way around that because you are criticizing something. Like you have to sort of say, okay, I am kind of criticizing something.
Yeah.
You didn't put the dishes in the dishwasher the right way, in my view.
Yeah.
Okay. So recognize it's going to sting.
Mm.
Be okay with that, that's like what you're going to do. And ask yourself, is this a necessary message for me to send?
Mm-hmm.
And is this a necessary message for me to send right now at this moment when he's just put the dishes in the dishwasher?
Right.
And so those two things will help guide you. And then so the third thing is, if this is a necessary message for me to send, and if it's a necessary message for me to send right now, knowing that it's going to hurt, that I'm telling him you failed, we wouldn't see it that way. But again, that's how he's going to see it. How can I handle it differently so that it's also telling him, but I really do appreciate you, right? So, for example, this is for whatever reason, this is what my brain is going back to. So when our kids were younger and I was traveling and speaking at a lot of women's events, there were a lot of days that Jeff, my husband, would get the kids ready for school. And I'm getting ready to run out the door to the airport or whatever. And which is awesome. Like, it was amazing of him. He's a fantastic dad, and he was often the one picking them up from school and, doing all that. And I can still remember there was a day that I'm like running out the door and the kids come downstairs in their normal clothes because Jeff has forgotten that this was like a field trip day and they were supposed to wear these like field trip t-shirts. Like they had specific t-shirts they were supposed to wear. And so that's an example of like, it actually matters to say something right
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
Even though, yeah, it's going to say you failed. And so what a lot of men said is when that is that situation, which it will be,
Mm-hmm.
like you're like, what happens if it is wrong?
Yeah,
Right?
exactly.
A lot of the men said they described it as a criticism sandwich. And so think of a sandwich where like you say thank you so much for getting the kids ready for school, like the praise, the
Uh-huh.
affirmation, the appreciation.
Mm-hmm.
You probably forgot they needed those red t-shirts. But thanks so much for doing that. I got to run.
Ah,
Really appreciate you.
yeah.
And so it's a sandwich with the criticism in the middle. Now,
Mm,
again, there are going to be women who are rolling their eyes as they're listening to this, like that should not bother him. And what we have to realize is the same thing that I finally had to realize after, because I had thought the exact same thing. I'm like, dude, you are so oversensitive. Like,
oh,
grow up, right? And I finally had to realize, wait a minute. The reason that I am saying that should not bother you is that it wouldn't bother me.
right. Exactly.
Different. He's not me. He's wired very differently.
Yeah.
And by the way, we can say wired very differently by a God who knew what he was doing.
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. And for any of those who are listening who are rolling their eyes, because my sister and I have had conversations where I don't do that whole like some women that are just better women than me, they're like, they know how to, and I don't want this to sound wrong, but play to the man's ego in a way that makes it more palatable for him to hear what you're saying. I think that's actually wisdom to be able to do that. But at the same time, in my soul, I'm like, I'm not going to grovel just so he hears what
I
I'm saying. You
know.
know, it
I
sounds,
know.
I guess it feels ingenuine or like flattery, and flattery feels inauthentic, right? And so I've always been like, whatever, I'm not going to burr, 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 burr. But at the same time, there's this phrase that we always use with our kids that love sees a need and meets it. And
Yeah.
so when we see that there's a need, love is going to say, okay, I'm going to meet that need because that's what you need,
Yeah.
regardless if that's what I would need. And so if you're rolling your eyes, like I have done for so very long around this topic, at the end of the day, if we don't really want to hurt the men in our lives, then this is something that's worth learning. And it just simply will make us more influential, right?
Well, it'll make us more influential. It'll give us what we want, which is a much better relationship.
Mm,
I mean, it makes sense, right? If you are constantly hurting, whether it's men or women, if you're constantly hurting the other person, again, without intending to,
hmm.
but you are, and I think you referenced in your email to me like 1,000 paper cuts.
Yeah.
Like, like there's this constant like little paper cuts. If you're constant, and sometimes more than paper cuts, right? Like if you have a paper cut over and over and over and over on the same cut, it's going to be a gash
Yeah.
and it's going to start bleeding,
Yeah.
right? It's going to need like stitches. And so if if you know this and you can sort of put your eye roll aside for a minute
Uh-huh.
and regardless, again, men or women, and actually try to speak to the inner person, assuming that they're in that 75 to 85%, right?
Uh-huh.
Not everybody will be.
Yeah.
Then what you're going to get is okay, you're going to get a person who's not being hurt over and over and over and over.
Yeah.
And you're going to get a person who's feeling built up and cared for. Like it just makes sense that you would have a better relationship
Yeah.
at that point. And it's one of the reasons why, just candidly, when For Women Only first came out, now that was 20 years ago, right? And we've worked really hard to get some of this stuff down into the kind of the knowledge base of people. So, but at the time, a lot of this was like, oh my gosh, I've never heard this before.
Hmm.
And we would get these emails that were like, I was getting on a plane to fly to where my husband, was to ask for a divorce.
Mm.
Bought your book in an airport bookstore, read it on the plane, got off the plane, asked my husband for forgiveness because I realized it wasn't just him, it was me. And
Wow.
now we have two kids and, we have this amazing life. Thank you. This book saved our marriage.
Wow.
which of course is a very emotional thing to read, those
Yeah.
kinds of things. We got a lot of those.
Yeah.
But I kept thinking, if a 200-page little bitty book, right? Like these are small little books. If a 200-page small book can save a marriage, there's a lot of tragically unnecessary divorces going on,
That's
and a lot
true.
of tragically unnecessary marriages that they may stay together but unhappy.
Yeah.
And so if you want that peace in your home, what I always tell women is what I needed to do, because I am a strong woman. I'm kind of like what you were talking about, like everything in me is like, but I shouldn't have to,
Yeah.
whatever. And what I always tell women is, if you are a believer, go to God and say, and it may be hard, say, Lord, I give you permission. If I need to have my eyes opened to something that I am not seeing right now, I give you permission to open my eyes. I give you permission and ask you to change my mind. If there's some area that needs to be changed, if I've got assumptions or attitudes that are hurting me in the end, open my eyes, change my mind. And God does.
Wow.
But you have to give him permission to do that, because in the end, this isn't really about you and your husband. It's about you and the Lord.
Oh, that's fair. I love that. Okay, so I literally want to cry that our time is up. I don't know how it passed so fast, but let me ask one last little question in
Sure.
summary. Um, I'm raising 4 teenage boys. A lot of my listeners are mothers or have simply men around them. How can we, and this will get in kind of the practical application side, what are maybe a couple suggestions you have on how we can draw out their tender, loving side in a very
Yeah.
intentional way? Because like I mentioned in my email, some days I cry when I go to bed because I'm like, these boys are so rude. Like they're rude. They don't say good night to me. They don't say good morning. They roll their eyes when I tell them I love them. Like they're hurting my feelings every day, you know? And so how can I, being proactive, do practical, simple things that will pull out their tender, loving side?
So it's going to be what you said that you feel like you didn't want to have to do. I'm just going to be really honest.
Spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down.
Yeah. It's gonna be what you feel like, I shouldn't have to do this. But I'll tell you what we found. If you think of those teenage boys, and maybe your husband, sort of depends on, the situation, but there's a tender heart in there. Right now it's surrounded by castle walls.
Yeah.
Those constant like things, the sarcasm, the stuff that hurts your feelings, that's a wall. That's all that is. Sarcasm is just hiding behind these little things that we think of, it's just joking. Yeah, it actually, at some point, there's a whole nother research project there that we dealt with sarcasm.
Oh, wow.
It's not always. It's actually hiding your feelings, your true feelings, behind a wall, behind a mask.
Wow.
Inside that wall, if you can get them to open the castle wall, inside there is a very tender heart that loves their mom, absolutely adores their mom, adores his wife.
Yeah.
And in what we did in one of the research projects is, I wanted to find out what would touch that heart. And it turns out that, like, for a woman, when your husband comes up behind you and gives you a big hug and says, I love you so much, like, that really touches your heart, because it's speaking to that inner place in you, that am I lovable place, right? For a man, believe it or not, what touches his heart is the words thank you. That's the equivalent for a man of I love you emotionally, because it says, I noticed that thing that you did on the outside. Remember, their question is, am I any good at what I do on the outside?
Yeah.
And it says, I noticed it. It's these little things, like, I noticed that you put the dishes in the dishwasher. Thank you. Even though in your head you're like, but you didn't do it right. Right. I noticed that you did it. Thank you for that. And it also says, the words thank you also say, it was good. I really appreciate it. And if you can look for things that you can say thank you for, as opposed to where your brain naturally goes is, but it wasn't, but what about, but if you can, at least for a season, even if it's just do it for 30 days, look for the things that you can say thank you for and actually get those words out of your mouth. You'll realize, I didn't say thank you or words of appreciation nearly as much as I thought I did.
Yeah.
We actually have some statistics on this. We don't say those words as much as we think we do. And you'll realize how often you say the negative things. And it's like, whoa, it is very convicting.
Wow.
And that is what just it doesn't break down those castle walls. It melts right through them.
Wow. Okay. So ladies, there is your challenge between now and the end of I don't know when I'm putting this episode up, but for the next 30 days, challenge yourself with that. I like that. That's so practical and so doable. And what a beautiful, eye-opening experiment. Okay. So I feel like I could literally interview you for like 4 more episodes, but let's do this. Why don't you share about how they can connect with you online and what your most recent book is about so they can get their hands on that too?
Absolutely. You can find me at all the social media platforms. You can find my blog at shaunti.com, which is we release this equipping blog. We spent a lot of time and effort basically talking about what we talked about here. Like, what are the 5 things your husband really wishes you knew about him? Like that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so that's the easiest way to connect with me. The latest book, the last one we released, is called Secrets of Sex and Marriage, because intimacy is a big issue in marriage, and there's a lot of myths and misunderstandings that on both sides that we need to know.
Yeah, that's so good. And honestly, I had more questions here queued up and ready for you about sex and his lonely burden to provide and all these things. I'm so sad we can't get to them. So you guys, you're going to want to get her book, the For Women Only. Maybe you have a girlfriend and both of you are frustrated in your marriages, or you just want to know how to love your husband better and your boys better. Go get the book, do it with a friend, and see what you learn from it. Just go support Shaunti and what she's doing. But thank you so much for coming on here. It was literally a gift to me to be able to talk to you.
Thank you. I really appreciate the chance to share.
Absolutely. Well, you guys, thanks so much for tuning in. And why don't you do this? Hit the share button on this episode right now and send it to a few of your girlfriends and say, hey, listen, sister, let's get this book together. Or just send it to anyone you feel like it's going to encourage them. Maybe even share it with your husband and say, hey, let's talk tonight. Is this what you think? Is this how you feel? And but you guys, we're here to support you and encourage you as you're growing with the Lord and growing in practical life things. And so thanks so much for tuning in. Make sure to hit subscribe wherever you're listening. Go check out Shaunti at shaunti.com, and we will see you guys next week. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much for tuning in to today's show. Listen, let's stay connected. Come follow me on Instagram at Java with Jen, where you can follow the latest and say hey. It's a really great way to stay in touch. Many of you have also asked how you can support the show. You can make donations through the Anchor app or on Patreon, or of course by sharing, rating, and reviewing on social media and iTunes as well. Your heartfelt feedback always reminds me why I do this. Also, don't miss our merch store, where you can get super cool Java with Jen swag and coffee. Find it at javawithjenmerch.com. Until next time, remember, hearing God's voice is simple, and He wants to be a part of your everyday life. See you next week.